Hello and welcome to episode 1 of a new podcast that we call Explainercast. I'm your host, Dave Smith.
And this is Shane Swenson.
And we are here to explain things.
Such as it is.
Shane and I decided to start this show because we feel like we might have some things to explain.
It sounds really egotistical, Dave. I'm a little worried about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we certainly get asked to explain things and maybe find ourselves in that position, so we figured why not try it here.
Yes, so Shane and I have chosen our topic for episode 1, sailing, like with sailboats.
Yes.
Shane, have you seen the movie What About Bob from the early 90s?
I have, but it was long enough ago that I've forgotten the entirety of it.
Bob Wiley, main character, played by Bill Murray.
Yep.
And he's scared of many, many things. That's probably his phobia is what the word I'm looking for. He's got tons of phobias,
sure.
One of which is going on the water. But some friends invite him to go sailing,
mm-hmm.
and he does. And they tie him to the mast of a sailboat. And he's just got his arms up in the air. And then he gets off the boat later and he's like, I sailed on my first try. And he says, the secret is I let the boat do the work.
That's right. And when in doubt, yes, trust the engineers. I guess is maybe the lesson there.
So Shane, you're a bit of a sailor. Would you like to tell us a little about your experience with sailing?
Sure. And a bit of a sailor is actually right on. I'm probably more a fan of sailing than any sort of expert at it, but I do think about how they work. I actually thought sailing was really uncool growing up because I grew up in the flatlands where power boats would be everything and the sailboats looked kind of lame. But when I was in college, they had a sailing club and a sailing pavilion, and finally senior year I got around to checking it out. And what I realized was that it's actually, to me, really interesting, really powerful to be able to capture the energy from the wind shearing across the water and create force and create speed and freedom to navigate just based on relatively simple phenomena. So at that point, I got pretty excited about it. I got into it, got my basic certificate so I could take boats out on the river in college. And then I moved to California and I realized I couldn't afford to be a member of the yacht club, but I kind of wanted to be yacht club adjacent. And so we would take out small sailboats from like the rental group associated with some of the local colleges there. And then we moved to Utah, and my wife thinks this was kind of ridiculous. We moved to a very landlocked state, and that's when I really got into sailing. And I joined a sailing club. I bought a sailboat, a very small sailboat. Oh. And she thinks that's hilarious. But honestly, we were not in the right economic position to be, members of the yacht club in California.
Right,
so.
Right place, wrong time.
That's right. And it turns out there were quite a few coastal dwellers who moved to Utah for various reasons. A lot of them for the outdoor recreation space. And so it actually made sense to get into sailing up here. And so I have a very small boat. It's called a laser. It's a single-handed dinghy with one sail. So it's cat-rigged is what that's called. And we sail them up.
Cat-rigged means one sail?
Yep. So you've got cat-rigged, which are a single main sail. So you have a mast that goes up, and the sail attaches to the mast at the leading edge of what's going to form a wing. And then you have a boom, which is perpendicular to the mast and goes towards the back of the boat at the bottom of the sail. And then the sail forms a triangle between the mast and the boom. And by pulling the boom more inboard or outboard, you can change the angle of the sail with respect to the boat. And then ultimately that's changing the angle of the sail with respect to the wind. And you're effectively controlling the angle of attack of a wing. That triangular sail forms a curved cambered shape, just like an airplane wing, and essentially curves the air, bends the direction of the air that's coming across it to create a lift force, which you then use to move through the water.
Okay, so this is like totally more complex than I think I ever appreciated before I talked to you about sailing. I literally, probably until I was 30, I thought sailing was the same thing as basically holding a bedsheet up in the air and catching the wind and just letting it push you through the water. But that is not at all what sailing is.
No, right? not in. Oh boy, this is where a little research might have helped us. I could tell you how many thousand years ago that stopped being the state of the art. But
so, just a few thousand years ago.
Yeah, maybe it's at least centuries. But originally, That's kind of what it was. And you picture, old sailing ships that had a mast and they had just a whole bunch of rectangular sails. I mean, they essentially were parachutes, and they're just going to go downwind. And that's why the trade winds were super important, because that's how you could efficiently move in those big, heavy boats that were essentially like floating bathtubs with a parachute attached. So yeah, so we're talking centuries
awesome
ago,
image.
not millennia. And so then the invention, and in those, I think you could angle the sail to a certain extent, and the boat had a keel, the really foundational structure at the bottom of the boat that would help it go forward and not so much sideways. And they had pretty big rudders, but fundamentally, if the wind wanted to blow the boat sideways, it was going to do it. And you could angle the sails to the wind to a certain extent, but you were mainly doing downwinders or kind of diagonals against that, is my understanding of those, think like Spanish galleons and things like that.
Okay.
So then the triangular sail was really, and I don't know when this came about, but the triangular sail is really the one that enabled a lot more flexibility, because it operated less like a parachute and more like a wing. You've got that leading edge attached to the mast. You've got the bottom of the sail attached to the boom, and so it's not so much that it's a triangle as that it was this shape that could be directed at different angles to the wind, and a triangle is an efficient shape to do that with.
So the shape, like if you were to pull a sail completely tight so that it was flat, like planar, would it no longer function as an efficient sail?
It would function efficiently maybe in very high wind at relatively low angles of attack.
Okay.
But given that it's going to be made out of probably some material with some stretch, it's still going to bow to a certain extent.
Okay. And you want that, right? Like you want it to be curved. Is that right?
Yeah. So if you look at airfoil design, that curvature is called camber, and it represents essentially from leading edge to trailing edge, the degree of departure from like a straight line that would connect the two. And typically the slower the airflow, the more camber you can use to redirect that airflow, and the more lift you can gain, but at the expense of greater drag.
You're saying lift, but the lift here is actually like sideways, right?
That's right. So
because it's a wing, but it's a wing that's not oriented the same way as an airplane wing.
Exactly. So if you pictured an airplane and you took one wing and then you laid that airplane on its side, so the one wing was pointed straight up in the air,
and you cut off the other wing.
And you cut off the other wing.
Put some of the other wing in the water.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, when we talk about keels, and so forth, we can talk about the second wing. But yes, the wing that's in the air essentially is pointed straight up from the root of the wing to the tip of the wing, or the part, on an airplane, the part that connects to the fuselage, the body of the airplane, is the root, and the tip is, the tip that's outboard. And in this case, the top of your mast is typically going to be the tip of your wing. And then the wing has a leading edge and a trailing edge. And so the leading edge is the edge that is first meeting the wind. So it's the front of the wing on an airplane. And that's, again, the mast on the sailboat. And then the trailing edge is where the wind departs the wing. And so that's at the back of the wing on the airplane. And again, that's toward the back of your sailboat. On an airplane, you want the lift to lift the airplane up against, the force of gravity. On a sailboat, you do create lift. And then, yes, it's going to generally pull to the side, but the important part is it also pulls you forward. And so it creates a force that's typically on a diagonal, forward and to the downwind side of the boat. And so by itself, that would push the boat along that diagonal. But then the boat has something in the water. And a classic sailboat has what's called a keel, which essentially is kind of a big, heavy wing that goes straight under the bottom of the boat. Lighter weight boats have other similar functions. They'll have what they call dagger boards. The main difference between a dagger board and a keel being the keel implies a heavy enough weight to keep the boat upright, dangling below it.
So it serves two purposes. Not only does it keep it straight, but also keeps it upright. If it tilts over, it comes back up.
That's right. And on a classic monohull, single hull sailing boat, that's actually super important, because if we picture this boat, and we're starting to construct it now, at least in our virtual, in our thought processes here, we've got the hull of the boat floating on the water. We've got a mast sticking up in the air, and we've got the wind, and we've got a sail attached to that mast and the boom. The wind is blowing, and we're essentially creating a lift force, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we create that lift force. But we know that that lift force is pushing us on a diagonal somewhat forward and somewhat to the side. But the other thing is that the center of pressure of that lift force, if we think about where the average force is on that sail, it's somewhere up in the air above the deck of the boat.
Oh, yeah. So it's going to want to make it tip over.
Exactly. And so you're pushing to the side on this lever that's sticking up off the, up partway up the mast. And when you do that, it's going to make the boat lean over. And so the weight of the keel is designed to provide a counterforce to hold the boat not straight up and down, not straight vertically oriented or in its like resting position, but on some kind of appropriate diagonal.
Before you go on, let me ask about that keel. So given the buoyant force upward of the water on the keel, does it have to be exceptionally heavy to provide... Better question, is it gravity that is pulling the keel back down?
Yeah.
Or is it something else?
So on a classic keel boat, it's gravity. And then again, there are alternatives for more advanced boats. So that keel is typically it's, how do you describe it? It's a little bit like a rudder, but it's typically mounted more in the center of the boat. And you also have a rudder in the back that you're going to use for steering. And that also provides a small amount of what we call righting moment, meaning a force that wants to bring you back upright. But a classic keel would have a big, like torpedo-shaped lead weight mounted to the bottom of it.
Yes. I've seen these.
Yeah. So you can picture now there's kind of this fin that sticks down from the boat, and then it has this bulbous thing at the bottom, and that's just giving it enough weight to achieve enough righting moment to ensure that it can cope with the natural buoyancy of the boat itself and ensure that the boat is stable. Like you tip it all the way on its side, it should come back upright. It shouldn't turtle or go upside down.
So let me ask you just a silly question.
Yeah.
In your laser, which is a smaller sailboat,
yes,
do you have to detach that thing to transport it around?
So the laser makes a small departure from what we've talked about so far, and that is that it is not a fixed keel boat. So it does not have a weighted keel. It has something else called a dagger board, which still provides the function of making the boat want to go forward and not sideways. So it's kind of it's like a symmetric wing shape. Again, it kind of has a rounded leading edge and a sharper trailing edge. It's called a dagger board because it goes through the hull of the boat. There's sort of a box, a watertight box that's built that allows something to go straight through to the bottom.
You can raise and lower it?
That's right. And so you take it out for transport.
Okay.
You also take it out or lift it up for downwind when you don't need that force. And it's very light, so it does not provide a righting moment. And on a laser, the righting moment comes from the sailor's body weight. So you have to position yourself.
You got to throw yourself around.
That's right.
Keep that thing upright.
That's
so if you do it wrong, you're going over.
Yes, and I've done
Whereas a keeled boat will...
should right itself. Yeah. So on a laser, you can crash them.
I think you were about to admit that you've made some mistakes here. Why don't you just come clean about how often you've thrown yourself in the water because you didn't go to the right place at the right time?
Yeah. So, when I was in my 20s and my appetite for risk was higher, like I'd crash a lot. And then you start looking at all the lines and the tangling possibilities, and I've probably gotten a little more conservative in the wind that I'll sail my laser in. But yeah, they have some, if you get a puff or a gust of wind and it increases the force rapidly and you're not positioned for it, it can blow you right over. They're also, lasers are notoriously unstable going downwind, because when you're going downwind and your sail turns a little bit into a parachute. But if you get some side component to the wind, like a wind shift, or you turn the boat a little bit, maybe without realizing it, and you suddenly get some breeze that's blowing across the sail, it'll create maybe a rapid sort of sideways component and just throw you into the water. And you'll see people, they crash, somewhat regularly in the level of sailing that I'm involved in, at least. Going downwind.
So given that you're sitting on the wrong side of the boat when that happens, or maybe you just haven't leaned out far enough, and that one side just lifts up, do people sometimes just get launched by that like a catapult?
I've seen and experienced that, not on a laser, but on a beach catamaran. So there are a few different brands. The classic one is called a Hobie Cat. So a catamaran is a twin-hulled boat, and rather than rely on a keel, they rely on kind of the fact that the hull is split into these two pontoons that are off to the side. And so they create kind of a stable platform between them. And typically these are relatively lightweight boats with a lot of sail area, so they generate a lot of force. And when you get them up on one of those pontoons, you have half the wetted area, half the amount of hull in the water, and you can go really fast because you have much lower drag in the water. But if you get it wrong and you say like nosedive or make some other mistake, those can launch you pretty significantly. And so, yeah, I've been thrown in the water off of a cat before.
How far were you chucked?
I'm not sure I kept my eyes open, and then the boat was still moving, so I can't attest to any specifics there. It was scary though.
Yeah, I'll bet. Oh man, cool. All right, where were we before I interrupted on the
Yeah, so I mean we were talking about
keel, basically how to keep these things upright.
That's right. Yeah, and the keel is the first mode. We talked about body weight is the second mode. A third is like with a catamaran or a trimaran, 3 hulls, where you set some outrigger that's out far enough to the side that doesn't want to go under the water. It's buoyant. That'll keep it up. And then another mechanism that's become really popular in the last at least 5 years, maybe more, maybe 10, are hydrofoils. So people use kind of curved dagger boards that essentially, as they go under the water through the hull, they curve and become horizontal, and now they provide lift. And so you can use that to also do 2 things. One of them is to help provide a riding moment, like out on a catamaran or out on the edge of the hull. But you can also then use that to lift the hull out of the water, which dramatically reduces drag, allowing you to go a lot faster.
But also, so I'm a little unclear on how a hydrofoil provides riding moment.
2 ways, and this is where I'm at the edge of what I've observed. One of them is essentially in like a cat rig or a catamaran, where you've got these hulls outboard. Putting a hydrofoil in the water, it essentially can take the place of the buoyancy that the hull was providing. So it's a lift force that's out where that hull is. So it's the same as what the hull was doing, but just lower drag. The other is sometimes monohulls these days in some of the kind of high-end racing classes will have a couple things. One of them is what's called a canting keel. So a keel that faces straight down as the boat tips on an angle creates more riding force because you're lifting the keel weight off to the side. Mm-hmm. But if you want to, at a lower heel angle or tipping angle of the sailboat, create more riding force, if you actually swing the keel out to the side, then that weight is kind of pulling back to vertical and you get more lifting or more riding force. So that's one thing that people do. The other is they'll put dagger boards out on the sides of the hull itself. And so if those dagger boards have a hydrofoil component to them, now you've created a source of lift that's outboard attached to the hull, even of a monohull. And so if it's providing lift on the downwind side outboard, then that's also a riding moment because it's not at the center of the boat, not under the center of mass.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, hydrofoil hanging off the side, kind of at an angle or like straight laterally off the side?
I'd have to probably search to see, and they're usually curved so that they can kind of optimize the both. Because again, they use them for dual purpose. It's both that it's both to select the forward component of the force that your sail's generating, that lift force, and to exclude the sideways component, the lateral component. And then it's also to provide lift, again, to right the boat and to lift the hull out of the water.
Right, to reduce drag.
That's right.
Okay, I got it. So it's interesting. We're saying all these words like lift, which I usually associate with airplanes and aviation.
Yep.
But the lift direction is in all these weird ways, and sometimes it's lift with air, and sometimes it's lift with water.
Yes.
Right. In the case of a hydrofoil, you're actually dipping a wing into the water.
Yep.
And when it encounters that water, the angle of the attack of the wing and the teardrop shape, like the typical wing shape, will actually make it want to rise out of the water.
That's
which
right.
means it will resist dumping the boat over to that side further.
Exactly.
That is so interesting.
Yep. And then
I never would have thought of that.
And so if you think about a wing or a foil, what you're really doing is you are interacting with a moving fluid field. And so we think of airplane wings and airfoils, and these sails, these air, base sails are again a form of an airfoil. And a hydrofoil just means the same thing happening in water, in a fluid, a much denser fluid. And so
in a way, it's a lot easier to manipulate and generate lift at even much lower speeds because you have so much mass
that's right.
that you're working against.
Exactly. Because, the amount of force you can produce is really a function of the amount of mass that's being affected by the foil. And so water being much denser than air, you can have a much smaller foil interact with that water and generate a lot of lift.
Like an idea I'm forming in my mind of how to explain the difference between the lifting force that comes from air versus the lifting force that comes from water is, when you're a kid and you're driving down the road in your car and you roll down the window and say you're doing like 40 miles an hour and you put your hand out the window and you hold your palm down and your fingers all together and you tilt the leading edge of your hand upward and your arm raises, right?
Yep.
And now I'm thinking, imagine if you were in a boat going 40 miles an hour and you dipped your hand into the water and tipped it up. Like, in fact, your hand would skip along the surface of the water because it generates, that's actually lift.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, probably a combination of lift and also surface tension, but mostly lift, right? Just bounce. You'd be skipping along the water. And in fact, it's the same phenomenon that makes rocks skip when you throw them along the water, is it will literally bounce off of the water rather than go into it.
Exactly. And in fact, I haven't done the math on this, but the things you just talked about, when you set your hand on the water or you skip a stone, or think about water skiing and how much faster you'd have to go to air ski with that same ski setup.
You'd have to go like 500 miles an hour to air ski. Is that even possible? Could you generate lift off the bottom of a ski?
Yeah, you could, but your drag from your body attached to the skis would be problematic in that configuration.
It would be, and this is like Olympic ski jumping, right? I mean, they jump off this thing, and they're essentially generating lift to extend the lateral direction of their fall.
And I'm actually really curious how much lift force they generate, because I mean they're still falling. They don't like go fly off like a wingsuit.
Not even close. Like the glide ratio is trash compared to like a glider.
But if you look at their body positioning, they lean way forward. They release the heel, kind of like a Nordic binding on a ski.
Yep.
And I think that serves two purposes. And then I want to go back to the water skiing thing. It serves two purposes. One of them is, again, dramatically reducing their body drag. The profile that you present standing upright versus that profile leaned way over, presents much less surface area facing the wind, so you have lower drag. And I don't know if they're able to create enough sort of curvature that their body is actually helping generate a very small amount of lift, just through the curvature and camber of their profile.
Right.
I mean, and that's why water skiing works, is it's taking advantage of the fact that your skis are interacting with the water, but your body's interacting with the air.
Yeah, the differential lets you stay on top.
Yep.
Yeah, like you could water ski underwater, like fully submersed, right?
Yeah, but
and it wouldn't take much towing force to really pop you up.
Yeah,
to lift you off the.
That's right. And I think what you'd find is that your body, the drag generated by your body, especially in that upright position, immersed in the water, is immense.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's, with water skiing and wakeboarding and those types of sports, getting pulled from the lying in the water position to the upright position, it takes a lot of work. And then once you're upright, the force dramatically reduces because you're now kind of planing on top. And so, probably a couple of places to go, but one last thing just on the planing concept is you're only interacting with usually one of the two surfaces of your wing. When you're water skiing, the bottom surface is interacting with the water. And something just interesting to think about, whether it's with a sail or an airplane wing or a hydrofoil, is often the top surface is very important as well as the bottom surface. So the bottom surface kind of has, you can imagine, kind of this deflecting property like your bottom of your water ski. But when you're immersed in the medium, the top surface creates essentially a low pressure that pulls the fluid, the fluid sort of flowing along that surface being curved by it. And that's why the top surface of a wing is often more curved than the bottom. Is you generate a tremendous amount of the lift force by having the fluid track that top surface and almost be sort of sucked down or pulled down by it. It's not super intuitive, but it ends up being important.
Yeah, and in fact, I think, boy, we're going to get into aviation here real quick, but I think that the Bernoulli principle that I learned as a child that they claim makes wings fly is actually not quite accurate. They say that's the low pressure generated over the top because the molecules are moving, or the particles are moving faster than the bottom particles. Therefore, you have a pressure differential or force differential. Is actually not. I believe I've heard that that's not accurate.
I've heard the same, that it doesn't in itself explain enough, and the assumption that the particles that were, call it, adjacent at the stagnation point where they separated at the leading edge, that those would again rejoin on the trailing edge. That assumption is not correct.
Right.
And in fact, counterintuitively, I believe what I heard is that the upper surface particles reach the trailing edge faster than the lower surface particles.
Oh, it's the opposite of what I would have guessed.
Yeah,
Oh
so
my
it's actually
gosh.
a stronger effect than you would expect, and it's due to the circulation, the turning of the air, and it creates this net circulation around the wing. And ultimately, you're really just
So you're
turning
saying
that flow.
you're saying even though those top of the wing particles are moving faster than we thought, they still don't generate enough negative pressure upward.
At the end of the day, if you were to compute like a free body diagram and say, what are all the forces acting on this wing? They're going to explain what the wing does. And so, yes, there is negative pressure on top, positive pressure below. However, the assumption of velocity based on that, well, we were together before we separated and we must rejoin together, does not give you actually enough pressure difference to do the thing.
Right. Right.
It's more complex than that. And we've all experienced that too. Like, you can hold a flat hand and you can still generate lift out your window of your car as you're driving.
Right.
You don't
You
need
can fly
camber.
with a.
Yeah. And so it's really how efficiently can you turn the fluid flow, and then how much as a result you can then compute. Well, how much did I, affect the momentum of that fluid flow? I directed it downward, and so then I get a corresponding force pushing me upward or forward.
All right. Oh boy, it is so tempting to just now deviate completely to air flight. But let's
stick with sailing. Let's talk air flight future if we keep doing these
Yes.
conversations, which I'm hoping we do. This is fun.
Okay. Let's get back to the water. So
Okay.
I think I would love to ask you about this. So we've talked a lot about wings, but we haven't really yet delved into the main wing,
Okay.
the sail.
Yep.
And I don't know. Like I said before, I basically have, until I was an adult, I had this concept that you could basically hold a bed sheet up in the air and use it like a parachute to pull you along, and that's how
Right.
sailing worked. But
Right.
but the fact is, if you do that, and that does work, and that is sailing.
Yep.
But if you do that, you are limited in speed to the speed of the wind you are traveling with,
That's
and you are limited in direction.
Yep.
You can basically only go in the direction the wind is blowing. Maybe slight deviation.
If you're using the sort of passive parachutal bed sheet, you can probably travel with a sufficiently efficient boat and a good like keel or daggerboard system, probably in any reasonable direction that includes a downwind component. So
Okay.
the limit, which you would never achieve, would be perfect, perpendicular to the wind, but really you're probably limited to 45 degrees plus or minus from dead downwind.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. I wasn't thinking about the sail. So, like, if you're floating along in a garbage can with a bed sheet,
Yep.
you're just going to go the way the wind's going to blow you, and you're never going to go any faster.
Yeah, you're a buoy at that point. Yep.
Exactly. But a keel and a modern sail,
Yep.
where you actually have a boom and a mast with some camber in the sail, allows you to simultaneously go faster than the wind and go in nearly any direction you want, provided you're willing to take a circuitous path to get there, right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, so if we just talk about the keel first, because maybe it's a little simpler, that essentially says this is going to make the boat go forward, or backward, but we're going to generally choose forward. And the nice thing about water being such a dense medium is that we can very strongly select for forward travel at the expense of sideways drift by essentially having that thing be a roughly symmetric airfoil, so it doesn't have camber, but it's going to make the boat want to go forward and kind of track really efficiently. And you can do the same thing with dagger boards or other types of foils. So essentially where you point the boat, once you have any even relatively small amount of forward speed, it's going to want to keep going in that direction unless you use the rudder to change your direction. And so you can almost kind of think of that as assumed. So then at that point, you need the sail to create a force that has at least some forward component. And it could be a minority. So the vector of force generated by the sail could be mostly to the side. But as long as there's some forward bias to it, then that keel or the other foils that we put in the water will select the forward portion of that and essentially negate the sideways portion of it by resisting that sideways component. And that's where we need a righting moment because we're negating the sideways component and we're pushing sideways on the sail, the boat's going to want to tip. So as long as we have some way to right the boat, whether it's the weight of a keel or it's an out an outboard pontoon or foil. Now we've kept the boat upright. We've selected whatever forward component there is coming from the force generated by the sail, and now we move the boat forward.
You're saying that even if the wind is blowing 89 degrees off of your direction you want to travel, you can still harness that 1 degree of forward wind motion, like vector of the force, to propel yourself forward.
So I'm trying to picture the model. So I guess let's just walk around the compass. If we're going dead downwind, then we're going to just lay the sail out like a parachute, or it turns out modern efficient boats will actually go at an angle to the dead downwind to gain some speed. But typically the fastest point of sail is going to be some form of what's called a reach. Terminology. Sailing is full of jargon.
Yeah. I mean, so far we haven't really covered any jargon, so that's good.
Yeah, and maybe we stay away from that. But a reach essentially means you're going perpendicular to the wind. So
you can actually go perpendicular.
And that's actually your fastest point of sail on one of these sailboats we're talking about.
What?
Typically.
What do you mean by point of sail? Like your fastest, like water speed, on the water speed?
Yeah, so a point of sail refers to what direction is the boat facing and heading as a function of the wind direction. So am I trying to go straight into the wind? That actually doesn't typically work. So I'm usually limited to, instead of going directly upwind, I can, typical boat can go maybe 45 degrees offset on a diagonal. So you're headed
still
upwind
into the wind.
Mm-hmm.
What the? I mean, this is the part that's amazing to me.
And so maybe before we get there, understanding that that's a point of sail, if we angle away from the wind more so that the wind is coming, straight from the side. So again, we're 90 degrees offset from the direction of the wind. Now, just kind of for simple modeling, picture that your sail is kind of at maybe like a 30, you can have your sail pointed straight from front to back on the boat, but that's usually not the most efficient for this purpose. Imagine you let the boom out, so it's kind of going off the back corner of the boat, maybe 30 or 45 degrees offset from straight in line with the boat. And the wind now is hitting that sail from the side, and then the sail is causing that wind to curve toward the back of the boat. And so that generates this.
Because it's riding the camber.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Is it riding the inside of the camber or the outside?
Both. And again, it's both. It's kind of deflected by the inside, and it kind of wraps around the outside.
Oh yeah, because that air you can't have a vacuum, right? Like
that's
the air
right.
wants to collapse in on the space that's being left behind the sail.
Yeah, and if you think about a vacuum, would actually be a very powerful negative pressure that would probably pull you in some direction, wherever that vacuum is.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so,
oh my goodness.
So taking wind coming from the side.
So let me just, I got to make sure I understand something here. So you got wind flowing into the sail, and the sail is not like an airplane wing in the sense that it's solid. It's not. It's like it's like
fabric.
The upper surface of the wing.
You can make one that's solid, but the common case is fabric because they're a lot easier to put up, take down, make smaller, make bigger.
Yeah.
They're more flexible.
So
literally.
Assuming that we're basically dealing with the top surface of an airplane wing only, and we've hollowed out the wing and we've thrown away the bottom section of the wing.
And some of the early wings are like a hang glider wing are single surface, and so it behaves like that. In fact,
Yeah,
I was gonna say like a single surface hang glider is almost the same thing. In fact, they called it sky sailing, I think, when they first got going with it, because it basically is you're flying a symmetric sail, or like a triangular. I guess it's another shape of triangle, but it's almost like two sails connected together, if you will.
Yeah, and so the air is routed into the leading edge of that thing. It splits on either side of the fabric.
Yep.
And now you have two tracks of air flowing on either side of the fabric, but ultimately bending.
That's right.
And that bending motion, it's like, I'm trying to think of what that's like. It's like taking a hose and shooting water that came in one angle, but then you're rerouting the hose to shoot out water in a different angle. Like maybe you've got a hose and you aim it to the side, and even though the water came from behind you, you can aim it to the side and shoot sideways.
Yep.
And is that actually what's happening? Are you propelling those air particles sideways to get a little bit of?
Yes.
That is so weird.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so weird. So how did people figure this out?
Yeah, I don't know the history.
It's got to be like trial and error, right? Like there's no way this was computer models, right?
Not computers, but yeah, I mean, the triangular sail thing, I think, was a pretty wise invention. And so the parachute structure, was probably a little more obvious. People could see things being blown in the wind. And so
I thought of that as a kid with an umbrella,
Yeah, it's like exactly. And so, but yeah, the triangular sailing plan and the degree of control and flexibility it provides really was a game changer, because now you can navigate in any direction. And we kind of talked about it, even up to, say a 30 to 45 degree angle offset from straight up wind. And so then if you're willing to kind of what's called tack back and forth on diagonals, you can now make your way upwind, and do so pretty efficiently. So you picture that sticking your hand out the window of the car, going back to Newton's laws, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. When you tipped your hand and you lifted the leading edge, you increased the angle of attack of your hand wing relative to the wind. And that's essentially the angle that the cord line going from the leading edge to the trailing edge of the wing makes relative to the flow of fluid, in this case the wind. So you angle your hand, the front of your hand up. You feel that force lifting your hand. What's happening is your hand is directing some of those air particles down. And the amount of air particles that you're pushing down, the amount of momentum that you're imparting into the downward momentum you're imparting into those air particles is equal to the amount of force that you're feeling lifting your hand up. You also feel some drag. It's going to push your hand back. And all wings have this property. They form what's called lift and drag. And again, the more lift relative to drag is called the lift to drag ratio. And that's a measure of the efficiency of a given wing. And so then that's exactly what your sail is doing. And in fact, I did a little bit of sailing racing. And when you do that to the wind, you disturb the wind and you change its direction of flow. You also impart turbulence into it because we're not perfectly efficient.
Then if someone comes behind you, they don't have clear wind.
Exactly. And so it's a key strategy in head-to-head sail racing. You essentially do a couple of things strategically. One of them is there are right-of-way rules about who has to yield to whom. And so you try to use the right-of-way rules to your advantage. But the other is if you can get somebody else, a competitor, into that wind shadow that your wing is producing, your sail is producing.
You mess up their air.
They're toast. Yep. You'll have.
That's incredible. That is so cool. And you just can't see any of this with your eyes.
Except, well, you see, if you see the contrail of, a jet flying overhead, again, that's a representation of the disturbance of the air that took place, by the airplane passing through. But yeah,
all right.
In the wind, we don't see it. You just feel it.
That's amazing. Shane, I feel like we have a lot more to talk about on this, but I think we're getting to the end of our time here. I vote that we do a part 2.
I'm down. It sounds good.
Okay. And part 1 will be required listening. So congratulations, listener. If you made it this far, you are now prepared to consume part 2, which we will hopefully record.
Yes. We'll see where it takes us. Clearly, this was a journey.
I mean, I think for sure in part 2, we need to discuss more about how you actually pilot a boat.
Yep.
Is it right to say piloting a boat? No, right? Drive a boat?
You can, yeah. I mean, I guess we can steal the boat. We can helm the boat. But yeah, we'll figure that out.
Okay. I like helm. So like when you're helming the boat, you have to how do you choose where to put, where do you put the sail to go in different directions? You got to go upwind, you got to go downwind. Sometimes it's the wind is perpendicular. And in all these cases, the boat can go almost wherever you want within a lot bigger range than I think most people think. We got to talk about that.
Yep.
And then I think we also have to talk more about boat racing sailboat racing, because all these strategies are just fascinating. And Shane was telling me before the show, there's actually new categories of boats that are even more interesting, where there are rules and constraints that make them just wild and fast. And I think we have to talk later in part 2 about faster than wind travel, and is it possible?
Yes.
I'm thrilled to do part 2.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well, Dave. This was really fun.
Well, with that, this is a new podcast. We don't have a website. We don't have a Patreon. We don't have anything. We're just doing this for fun. And thank you so much for listening. We look forward to having you back for episode 2 of Sailing Explained.
Sounds great. See you then.